You advanced a constitutional theory so flawed that not a single justice, regardless of political appointment, found it credible. Crockett continued, her voice gaining firmness. Is that the constitutional expertise you believe I lack, Mr. Speaker? The atmosphere in the chamber had completely shifted. What began as a one-sided criticism from the Speaker had turned into a sharp point-by-point constitutional analysis, catching Johnson off guard. Senior Republicans began signaling urgently to parliamentary staff, seemingly searching for procedural means to halt the unexpected cross-examination of their Speaker. You accused me of misrepresenting our constitutional duties in judicial nominations, Crockett said, referencing Johnson's earlier remarks. Yet in 2016, you asserted that the Senate had no constitutional duty to consider a Supreme Court nominee during an election year. But in 2020, you claimed it did. She paused, letting the contradiction linger. Both statements cannot be constitutionally valid. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution does not change depending on which party holds power. The digital clock showed she had used 40 seconds of her 1-minute allowance. As she prepared her closing point, the room grew silent. Johnson, now visibly uneasy, seemed to weigh whether to use his gavel, an act that might stop further damage but would also reinforce her criticism of selective constitutional interpretation. Before he could decide, Crockett struck with her most pointed question yet. Mr. Speaker, you questioned my understanding of the Constitution, but as someone who has litigated and won constitutional cases in federal courts on behalf of Americans whose rights were denied, I must ask, how many constitutional cases have you personally argued and won in federal court? The question landed like a thunderclap. Everyone knew the answer. Despite Johnson's repeated claims of constitutional expertise, his courtroom experience was mostly limited to state cases involving narrow religious liberty issues, not federal constitutional law. Crockett, conversely, had built her career on federal constitutional advocacy, a fact well known among colleagues, though seldom mentioned by her until challenged. The 10-second warning light blinked on her microphone. She had saved her strongest line for last. Mr. Speaker, she said, her voice steady and resolute, there's a vast difference between quoting the Constitution and defending it in court for Americans whose rights have been denied. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the chamber. While you've used the Constitution as a rhetorical weapon to serve political aims, I've used it as a shield to protect voting rights, due process, and equal protection for citizens deprived of their constitutional birthright. Silence blanketed the chamber. In a few sentences, Crockett had not only defended her record, but reframed the entire exchange, from abstract constitutional talk to real constitutional defense. My understanding of our founding document, she continued, comes not from selective citation but from standing beside Americans whose constitutional rights were violated. Black voters purged from rolls, defendants denied fair trials, and citizens subjected to excessive force by the state. The chamber's power dynamic had completely reversed. Despite Johnson's position at the Speaker's podium, all attention was now on Crockett. Her command of constitutional principle and first-hand courtroom experience had transformed her from a target into an authority in less than a minute. You referenced my background in criminal defense as if it weakens my constitutional understanding, Crockett said, her tone sharpening. Those defendants were Americans presumed innocent under our Constitution, 3 of whom I helped exonerate after decades in prison for crimes they never committed, because their constitutional rights were violated. Johnson appeared frozen, realizing that cutting her off would only confirm her criticism of selective constitutional enforcement. Democratic members leaned forward, witnessing what many would later describe as a defining moment in modern congressional discourse. The Constitution isn't just words we memorize. Mr. Speaker, it's a set of promises we must keep. Promises that power will be checked, rights will be protected, and justice will remain accessible to all, not just to those who look like you or share your religious beliefs. Crockett's time was nearly up, but she delivered her closing with the precision of a litigator and the conviction of someone who had fought for those promises firsthand. So yes, Mr. Speaker, let's compare constitutional records. Let's see who has stood in federal courtrooms defending constitutional rights and who has merely claimed constitutional expertise while promoting theories rejected by every level of our judiciary. The difference between us isn't that you understand the Constitution better. It's that I've used it to deliver justice for Americans whose rights were denied by those sharing your selective interpretation of our founding charter. The red light flashed. Crockett nodded once. You questioned my qualifications from that podium, Mr. Speaker. But perhaps instead of questioning my understanding, you should reflect on the Supreme Court's unanimous rejection of your own constitutional theories. I yield back. As Crockett returned to her seat, the Democratic side erupted into a standing ovation, a rare breach of decorum that underscored the magnitude of both Johnson's attack and her response. Several moderate Republicans sat still, thoughtful, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. Johnson, pale and silent at the podium, seemed momentarily paralyzed by the unexpected constitutional challenge to his authority. Aides rushed to his side with notes, likely suggesting procedural tactics or talking points to reclaim control of the narrative, but the damage was done. In less than a minute of substantive argument, the power dynamic of the chamber, and perhaps the broader constitutional conversation, had been fundamentally altered. In responding to Johnson's attack, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend her constitutional credentials, she raised critical questions about Johnson's own grasp and application of constitutional principles. What began as a personal jab quickly evolved into a serious discussion on constitutional interpretation that reached far beyond the chamber walls. Johnson's attempt to publicly undermine a junior member turned into a defining moment of his speakership, broadcast live to millions of Americans now able to judge which lawmaker demonstrated deeper constitutional insight. Within minutes, clips of the exchange spread across all major social platforms. The hashtag constitutional clapback shot to the top of global trends. Crockett's calm, methodical dismantling of Johnson's argument reached over 30 million views by evening. A viral meme comparing Johnson's confident start with his stunned reaction carried the caption, "When you bring a speech to a constitutional fight." Major news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Breaking headlines read, CNN, Speaker questions. Congresswoman's legal background gets constitutional masterclass in return, Fox News. Dramatic House floor confrontation raises questions about Speaker's authority. Networks brought in legal experts and former judges to analyze what had just happened. This wasn't just political theater, explained a Harvard law professor on MSNBC. It was the difference between someone who talks about the Constitution and someone who has actually defended it in court. The moment Crockett asked how many constitutional cases Johnson had personally litigated became an instant classic. Law professors across the country said they planned to include it in future courses on constitutional advocacy. Outside the Capitol, reporters flooded the halls. When Crockett finally appeared surrounded by colleagues, questions came rapidly. Congresswoman, did you expect the Speaker to attack your credentials? Were you ready for that constitutional challenge? Will you pursue a formal censure of the Speaker? Crockett paused before answering calmly. Today's exchange was unfortunate but necessary. When the Speaker uses his position to personally attack a member's professional background and understanding of the Constitution, it requires a serious response. I would have preferred to debate these questions in a more appropriate setting, but I'll always stand by my record and understanding of our founding document. She then walked away, leaving reporters rushing to file their stories. Meanwhile, Johnson canceled his scheduled press briefing, with his staff citing scheduling conflicts, an explanation few believed after such a dramatic day. Inside the Capitol, the political impact was immediate. Senior Democrats who had viewed Crockett as a progressive newcomer began to see her as a leading constitutional voice. What she showed today wasn't just rhetoric, said the House Democratic leader. It was rigorous constitutional reasoning under pressure, the kind of leadership our caucus values. Across the aisle, Republicans privately admitted the exchange had backfired. He picked the wrong member to challenge on constitutional grounds, a veteran GOP lawmaker was overheard saying. It's like challenging Steph Curry to a three-point contest. More troubling for Johnson were growing concerns within his own party. Some moderates were uneasy about his use of the Speaker's platform for personal attacks, while members of the Freedom Caucus began questioning whether he truly possessed the constitutional expertise he claimed during his campaign for Speaker. By evening, Johnson released a written statement. While I stand by my concerns about rhetoric that undermines our institutions, I regret that today's exchange distracted from Congress's important work. I've reached out to Representative Crockett to discuss how we can move forward productively. The carefully worded statement satisfied few and only prolonged the controversy. Legal experts continued dissecting the exchange, noting that Crockett's comments about Johnson's amicus brief in Texas versus Pennsylvania were accurate and revealed much about his interpretive approach. For Crockett, the moment reshaped her national profile. Her office received interview requests from major outlets, legal journals sought her commentary, and law schools invited her to speak on constitutional advocacy. This wasn't just about one debate, Crockett later explained. It was about rejecting the idea that only certain people get to define constitutional authority. The Constitution belongs to everyone, not just those who use it to promote their own ideology. For Johnson, however, the fallout continued. His approval among Republican voters dropped sharply, and doubts spread within his caucus about his judgment and command of constitutional issues. His ability to lead debates on legal matters, from judicial nominations to executive power, was severely weakened. 3 months later, when another constitutional issue reached the House floor, Johnson took the unusual step of yielding the gavel before speaking in an unspoken acknowledgement that his authority on constitutional questions had been permanently damaged by that confrontation. Scholars and congressional observers called the moment historic. Crockett showed that meaningful constitutional debate requires more than citing credentials, wrote a Yale Law Journal professor. It demands genuine understanding and application. The broader lesson was clear: underestimate Jasmine Crockett at your own risk. The freshman congresswoman from Texas had transformed from a newcomer into a respected constitutional voice, reshaping perceptions of who holds true constitutional expertise in Congress. As one senior congressional aide told the Washington Post, before that exchange, authority came from background or ideology. Now it's about substance. You'd better know your argument, because someone like Crockett might expose its weaknesses for the whole country to see. For the public, the exchange provided a rare moment of clarity, when knowledge triumphed over hierarchy, and practical constitutional understanding outshined political posturing. The takeaway was unmistakable. In America's ongoing constitutional dialogue, influence doesn't come from title or tenure, but from the ability to connect foundational principles to real lives. That remarkable moment when Jasmine Crockett revealed the speaker's constitutional misunderstandings proved one thing: expertise always outweighs authority. Did you notice how quickly confidence turned to silence once faced with real facts?